Greetings, everyone. This is Dean Woodbeck from InCommon. Thank you for joining IAMOnline this afternoon. Our moderator today, who will take the helm from here, is Keith Wessel, the IAM guru from the University of Illinois. Keith?
Thank you, Dean. Hi, everyone, and thanks for joining us for today's IAMOnline, the monthly webinar series focused on identity and access management. And before we start, we want to let you know that IAMOnline is brought to you by InCommon, Internet2, and the EDUCAUSE Higher Education Information Security Council. One other note before we start, we'll be taking questions and comments today using the chat function of Adobe Connect. So as we go here, please send your questions or comments on the presentation in there, and we will address them. Today's speaker from Duke University is Mary McKee. She is a senior IT manager at Duke, and she will be talking to us today with a presentation with the very enticing title, Identities Are People Too, IAM Tooling That Works. So with no further ado, I'm going to turn things over to Mary.
Great. Thanks, Keith, and thanks, Dean, and everybody else who's taken the time to join today, especially Rob Carter, who I've got in the room with me here for moral support in case I faint. So I did just want to reiterate what Keith said, that we love questions, so feel free to jump in anytime in the chat if you've got anything, and Keith, obviously, feel free to interrupt me. So I think before we get into the hows of making IAM tools usable, I kind of wanted to take some time to get into the why. So I think probably the one thing that I hope people will take away from this conversation is that there is a real problem in our community with trying to oversimplify. I think that there's an expression that we hear a lot that people give as a guideline that I think is pretty dangerous, and it is this. Keep it simple, stupid. You hear that a lot as sort of a benchmark for how you should be designing your IAM tools, and I think it's really dangerous in our community, and by our community I mean IAM specifically, not just technology. I'm pretty new to this space. I've been in application development for a long time, but I've only been in identity and access management for about 3 years. And I have to say that you all had me at hello, because this is probably the only space that has consistently at every level delivered better on the tech than what it promised. And I think that's really beautiful and fun and exciting for me, but it's also sort of a missed opportunity for the community when people don't realize the real value proposition of what some of this infrastructure does. So I just kind of wanted to say our tools can't be simple because we work in infrastructure, and not all tech is infrastructure, but infrastructure is built for people, and people need to understand how that infrastructure works in order to effectively navigate it. So we're kind of missing the point of what we're doing if we are not making sure that we're drawing people in. With that, I would like to present a different approach, and I hope that you will all forgive me for this next slide, which is an alternate. It's keep it clear, compadre, as opposed to kiss or try and kick. Simple is just not available to us. There was a time where that was an option, but you know, with all the things that we have to deal with between different overlapping user bases, policy bases, all of those kinds of competing tensions, different ways of looking at problems, we are not able to just make it simple. And if we did, it wouldn't be as good. So that time has passed. And so before we get into some tactics about how to make things clear as opposed to just simple, I wanted to spend a couple slides talking about this at an abstract level and then kind of go more from the high-level strategy into some tactical approaches. So if we can agree on clear as an important thing we should be shooting for, why aren't we clear with our interfaces? And I think there's a lot of things that we blame for our lack of clarity. There are a lot of things that are just kind of getting in the way between funding and resources, other resources, tensions between different constituencies. But I think really the reason that we fail to make things clear to our end users is that a lot of times we fail to really make them clear to ourselves. So we want to make sure that everything that we do at a very high level. I can give you case studies and talk about specific things we've done, but what works for Duke may not work for you, and we hope that you'll apply the same sorts of principles and hopefully come up with different solutions. And then, the next time we're all together at TechX, we could talk about, pitting our solutions against each other and figuring out, what can we take from that, at a community level. So I think there are kind of two high-level guides to clarity. And I wanted to cover those. I'm just catching up. It looks like we're okay on audio. All right, we'll just keep going. So the first key to having clarity of thought around your IAM tooling is to make sure that you are navigating mental models. So mental models are a lot like that scene in The Matrix where Keanu Reeves just suddenly instantly knows Kung Fu. It's a way that you can leverage something that is very complex that a user already knows to get them to understand something that is similarly complex. And this is how humans understand things to begin with. So if you don't help them navigate to the right mental models, they will often choose the wrong mental model. So I have a couple of things. Many in this webinar have heard me talk about how I think that we miss a lot of opportunities by not constantly talking about federation or federated authentication in terms of a passport model. I think it's actually a perfect analog for what happens with federated digital authentication. And I think that there are also a lot of competing views that are in industry that aren't really appropriate in our community. So I want to make sure that we're thinking about what is industry doing, what are we doing, and what really is the fundamental value behind what we're doing. So if we're all invested in this model where authorities matter and authorities are able to assert identity, we probably don't want to use the same usability principles that we would be using if we were just trying to get a daily active users sort of metric and we were just going to trust people to give us an email address. So I have a little note here in bold that the one thing that really breaks my heart in our community is when people talk about trying to do IDP discovery based on parsing an email address. I think that when you solicit an email address from someone, you are attaching a mental model of, just give us a way to contact you, we'll trust whatever your identity is. And in a federated model, that's really not consistent with what we're trying to offer. And again, going back to the infrastructure model, it wouldn't be helpful to build a freeway if people weren't aware that it existed. So that's something that I think when you're looking at things from a high level, we always have to be going back to what mental models apply here, what are people going to compare this to, and is that comparison a fair thing? And I would encourage all of you as fun homework to try the passport analogy on your Luddite friends. See if you can get them to understand federated authentication by saying, this system where credentials look the same but aren't the same, they don't have inherently better or worse value in all contexts, but on a per context basis they may. Sometimes those credentials need to be supplemented with other things, visas. I think those are things that if you have a good model, you can get people to understand things that they wouldn't have the patience to try to understand otherwise. So that's the first key to trying to have clarity around what your service is trying to do and how it works. The first one is mental models. The second one is service values. And I titled this slide, Get Off My Lawn, because I think service values are really more about what are the boundaries of your service. I think a lot of times people don't really understand how much users are willing to accept as long as the boundaries are clear. When they get frustrated is when they have an expectation that something's going to work a certain way, and it doesn't. So as an example to this, we have our Duke OneLink service, which is a alternate non-net ID credential that can come in the form of a social account, which provides the credential but not the identity, or a username and password that was custom rolled. And so there are a few things, and we'll talk about this later in one of the case studies, but we really have to put some stakes in the ground around Duke OneLink, saying, it's an alternate credential. It's not something that's better than a federated. It's just something, if somebody needs to get people and they don't have net IDs and they don't have any other credential they can use, you can do that. We're not going to issue them instantly. People want those credentials to be associated with real identities for a number of very valid reasons. So, it's not quick and dirty, and we're not going to promise that it is. It's not an alternate identity. People need to understand that. Otherwise, they try to sign up for the wrong reasons. And as a service that uses OneLink, we are not making any promises about your ability to turn off credentials because a lot of services use OneLink, and you should be doing authorization separately. So I think there were just a couple thoughts there. One of them got cut off by Adobe Connect, which is that I think one way to know, a good metric for knowing if you are really doing a good job at cultivating your service values is to keep an eye on your request to deliverable ratio. And by that I mean when your developers or architects or anybody who's involved in helping bring these things together, if they talk to 5 different stakeholders and hear 5 different complaints, are they harvesting 1 or 2 deliverables, or are they harvesting 5? Because if you have good values, you tend to collapse on, oh, we see the underlying problem, and maybe we're not trying to we're not treating the symptoms, we're trying to treat the underlying cause. And then the other one that did show up on the screen is that you should be flexible, because sometimes you have to pivot on a service and you realize that the value that got you here is not going to take you any farther, and at that point you kind of need to look at that. So as we look at the coming slides, I'd kind of like to keep coming back to these 2 things of how are people thinking about these tools in terms of mental models and also service values. So moving on to tactics. We have some research methods here. I have a quote that I like here, which is, research is what I'm doing when I don't know what I'm doing. And the first one of those, before we get into it too much, I did want to do a shout out for a team at OIT that we love called the Creative and UX team. And you may or may not have a team like this at your institution, but if you're not sure, I would really encourage you to look out to see if you have a team that does formal usability testing. It is really, really a luxury to be able to outsource usability research to somebody who has no stake in your application whatsoever. And I really appreciate that we can look for time with the Creative and UX team to say, hey, this is how we're planning on doing it, and have them be immediately skeptical of what we're trying to accomplish. And through the process, we discover a lot together. So it's really been a very, very productive partnership. And it's really nice to have someone advocate for the user and keep us honest about things that are putting undue burden on users. I have just quick, I'm not going to go through all the steps of what we do here with the Creative and UX team, but it's a very iterative approach. And I did want to call out the N equals 6 on point 2, which is that this is a sort of industry standard around, you don't need to interview 100 people on an iteration. You only really need to talk to 6 people before you've discovered some problems. And so they'll talk to 6 people, they'll give us some recommendations based on the common problems they found. We'll do another iteration, they'll talk to another 6 people. One example of how this is working is with the consent-informed attribute release project that Rob and I are working on in conjunction with a lot of people in this community. And we are currently looking at 15 more iterations on the front-end intercept interface, just one of those interfaces, because it's really important to make sure that we're moving in the right direction and consistently and reliably solving problems. One more slide just on that is from the design phase when you're working on a new tool. If you have a creative or usability team that can do usability testing, or any sort of resources that can do usability testing, we really do want to make a strong recommendation for it, because it's been very helpful for us. And I wanted to call out a slide for that just in case anybody in the webinar has not actually seen usability testing take place. Personally, my background is really very much more in sort of back-end metrics, and I have not always had the most generous opinion of getting a 6 data point figure and trying to plan strategy around that. But they have made a believer out of me, and I think there are a lot of things that usability testing will unearth that metrics won't. So, not just did they click the button, but why they clicked the button and what they thought would happen when they clicked the button, and if they were happy with what happened after they clicked the button. So that's a great thing to do when you are going through the design phase.
Mary, let me ask you a question.
Sure.
For organizations who haven't done a lot with usability testing or who are exploring to see what resources are available to them that they might not know about in their organization, when you do approach your design group or whatever group might be handling it, what information is it good to have in hand to help jumpstart that conversation if you don't have an ongoing relationship to do this kind of thing with folks in your organization?
Well, if you have the luxury, and tell me, Keith, if this doesn't address your question, but if you have the luxury of a team like this, what they will do that is hard to do internally is look for ways to bypass your team's own internal biases. So they will generally start out by asking you to explain what you're trying to accomplish, asking you for contacts about stakeholders, target audiences, and then they'll go talk to your stakeholders and target audiences in order to figure it out. I do have some slides later, or a little bit of information about what I would recommend you do if you don't have access to a team like this. But in general, I think what they're looking to do is advocate for the user. And they are not very interested in you telling them how the user should be thinking about it. They're more interested in, what is the problem that we're trying to solve here and what are we trying to get the user to do, and then take a user-first approach to that design. Does that answer your question, Keith? Or did
that absolutely answers the question, yes.
Excellent. So then kind of moving on from the design phase. And another thing I wanted to mention about the design phase is I think a lot of people think that these creative teams are really just very visual design oriented. And I think it's important to note that a lot of the usability testing we do is based on extremely crude kind of grayscale wireframes that have very little decoration whatsoever. And what they're looking to test is where it is on the page, what language is being used, how people interact with the elements on that page. So you go through that, and then once you get pretty close to the final product, then you kind of get your design team coming in. So once you start moving to the implementation phase, I think it's really important to design for metrics, with metrics in mind. If you are ever implementing your own product, it's probably web-based, and you've probably been in this game long enough to know that it's going to get replaced many times before it gets retired. But if you do a really good job with your data model, that will live forever. And I think it's a good idea to make sure that you can get that sort of long-term sort of metrics ability by getting that data model right just out of the gate. So if you're designing for maximum analytical potential, you'll have all sorts of things to analyze. And I think it's really important to make sure that those metrics are very non-opinionated. You don't necessarily know what you're looking for. So anything that you can do to capture a little bit more information, I think is great. As far as user-first interfaces go, this is just a little note from having made this mistake many times. If you have a context where users aren't authenticated and you don't necessarily know who they are, and you're asking them to tell you, it's usually good to have them do that first. Because if you have a multi-step process and the process breaks somewhere along the way, it's very hard to pinpoint either what about that person's information broke your app or the ability to contact that person if that's something that's appropriate for the use case. And the other thing is, this is a little bit different than sort of database-driven metrics or information that you're capturing. Log everything that you can that doesn't cause you any headaches about, obviously there are some things that for very good reason we choose not to log. But when you have multiple systems that are logging lots of things, at Duke we are big Splunk users. And one thing that we like to do is create something that we've been calling a stream ID, for lack of a better term. A stream ID is essentially a prefix with a microsecond timestamp. And Rob could tell you here, there are some systems that he runs, some systems that I run, and there are a lot of things that people jump back and forth between those systems. And if the systems are referring users to other systems, it's kind of nice to be able to say, we tracked it, and then also we kicked them over to you via web service, and we sent a stream ID so that when you log, you're able to capture that this was the same person that we sent over. And that's been really nice on a lot of occasions where we're trying to do some forensic piecing together of what even happened with this person in this process. So moving on to the pre-production state, I'm going to explain this picture real quick, which is Kirk is one of our team leads, and he recently made the mistake of leaving the office for an extended period of time on paternity leave, and we took the opportunity to redecorate his entire cube with various photos of himself. So he is sitting on a chair there that is fabric that has his face all over it, and he was a very good sport and wore the matching outfit for that photo to be taken. Kirk is doing something for us, and it's very likely that whether you've named this person or not on your team, that you actually have a Kirk within your organization. And that is that he's really good at support architecture. So usability people are going to think about what's the best user interface, what's the best design for someone to get to a specific end. But there's always going to be the problem where somebody did get an error or something bad happened, and most of us have service desks that get called. Those service desks need to have opportunities to adequately triage at what point in the process did this go wrong. When somebody calls the service desk with an error that is completely opaque to them, that causes a lot of frustration on everybody's part. So Kirk has worked with every tier of support at OIT, and so he's been a great asset to us in terms of when we are rolling out a new service or someone else is rolling out a major service that leverages our architecture, we make sure to send Kirk, in addition to the usability people, to just listen in and think, if something went wrong with that, how would the service desk triage that? And have you written the appropriate KB articles, or do you need someone to help you vet to make sure that it's clear whose responsibility is what and what team is in a position to help with that? So that's the pre-production phase. Post-production, another little hat tip to Kirk. There's a photo here of a cup someone put together that says 5 cents if you come to Kirk and 10 cents if Kirk comes to you. It's important to make sure that you have ways to track problems with your applications, because all of this is a very iterative sort of process, and it's important to know what isn't going well with your application. So when you're getting tickets, it's great. We're all looking for tickets that reveal bugs so that we can fix the bugs. But I think we're all also often guilty of getting tickets where we say, this isn't a bug, that's exactly how it's supposed to work. And instead of just closing that as incomplete and sending maybe a snarky message back to the person who filed it, that's actually a real nugget to take away, to say, oh, where did this person get confused about what the boundaries of the service were? What were the values of the service that we didn't communicate about where it starts and where it stops? Another thing is just a personal favorite. This comes back from my days as a team lead on a development team. Exception reporting. I really think that if you've got any in-house developers, they should be getting email alerts with every notification that comes through their system. And they're not allowed to filter them. They can just fix the bugs, because if you know about a bug, there's really no excuse to not get to it. And the last thing is to make sure to talk to your service desk or any other support units that you have in your office. Because there's a lot of times that we kind of delegate the pain out to other teams, and they're able to deal with it, but they might have some insights into what isn't really working well with your service that might not escalate to you. So with that, those are some sort of tactics, and I kind of wanted to jump into ways that we have applied these things. And I do want to emphasize with this that we're not looking to say we made this change and you should make the exact same change in your environment. It's really more just sort of illustrating how we use these tools to get through a process. So these are my case studies in failure. I think that we are constantly looking for ways to identify failures with our services and try to make them a little bit better. So I don't mean that in a negative way. I think it's just failure is not a dirty word, and we should just think about that. So the first thing, I mentioned earlier that we have an alternate credential service called OneLink. And when we initially rolled it out, we had a lot of goals that seemed pretty reasonable. We wanted it to be one-step seamless registration. And it really wasn't until the service started to get big that we realized that that also means a completely opaque failure process that is completely unsupportable. You bind all these different things that can fail independently together, and then when someone calls the service desk has no way to know how to route them. My source on this was that everybody hated us during these years. And we were trying to kind of build the plane as we were flying it because OneLink has grown very fast since it came out years ago. And so we're trying to keep up with all the problems that come from the fact that anytime someone had a bug, the service desk had no idea what to do with it, and every single bug had to be thoroughly researched by multiple teams because too many dependencies were bundled together. We had a lot of great lofty ideas about letting services register users on the user's behalf, managing communication and branding. And then we found out that people ended up going and signing up every time they wanted to use OneLink for each individual service because they didn't realize that it was a centralized offering. We tried giving people guaranteed instantaneous accounts. That was important to stakeholders, and that was fantastic because then we were guaranteeing that everybody had 100 accounts. You can see where I'm going with this. We made a lot of promises to different users saying, you know, for your service, when somebody registers, we can set this custom attribute. Sure, no problem. We'll be happy to help you with that. That won't surprise you. It didn't scale well either because binding dependencies on registration means that if you're already registered for, you know, a different way, then you're not able to get the functionality that you need for this service. So again, we had an architecture that really encouraged people to re-register many times. We had some custom IDP login pages. There were concerns about OneLink being a distraction from NetID, so instead of offering them side by side, we had a OneLink first version and a NetID first version to try to encourage people to use the appropriate. We tried to anticipate what they would want to do. And that wasn't good because we found out that people were not good predictors of what kinds of credentials their users would have. And also, it means that if you had the de-emphasized credential, you probably missed the prompt because it was too de-emphasized. And then the last one, we had two classes of user in mind. We thought OneLink is for the external user, and NetID is for the internal user, and that makes it all very clean and tidy. But of course, it couldn't be that simple. So I think the major takeaway for us about this was that we were so concerned in the original architecture about making it easy for people to get going that we sacrificed the idea of making it easy to keep using over time. So with those painful realizations in mind, we started thinking about OneLink version 2. And that is a story of some difficult choices. You can imagine when we realized that we were going to have to break some promises, we were going to have to tell our stakeholders that we were planning on making registration harder and that all of the custom development we had done for their individual services was going away. And then we were going to take away their ability to brand the OneLink experience in a way that was nice for their site. We did not expect those things to be popular, but we realized that they were going to be necessary. So we did a couple things to try to get some buy-in. We launched a reporting console. A lot of people were saying, well, your usability research says this, but we're not sure that we're bought into that because our users are very different than other users, which I'm sure is something that you've all heard. So what we did was we introduced this idea of referral codes so that we could break down and slice and dice the metrics we were providing based on the referrer to say, okay, well, that's fine. If you think that our overall metrics are not accurate, then just pull up the metrics for just the users you referred to us and tell us, keep us accountable. If you think that our services are overly benefiting some services but not yours, then that's something that we want to know about. We also want to make sure that if other people think that our metrics are biased, that any one of our stakeholders could suggest a different metric and we would collect it. So whatever you think is relevant, let's look at it. We're open to ideas. We're not here using metrics in the most evil way that really upsets me, which is to prove a point that we already had. We were really using metrics in an exploratory way, and we encourage people to submit requests for other metrics. So we did a lot of usability testing. We did a lot of back-end metrics collection and showing that. And then we did a roadshow that we called OneLink version 2, this time it's personal. And that was about what is going to be better long-term about giving real identities to OneLink users. The results of this, even though we were really worried that OneLink was going to be, the version 2 was going to be a tough sell, we thought, well, we'll start onboarding new users with V2, and we'll try to figure out how we can get the OneLink V1 users, who largely helped develop this service, to switch over. They're not going to want to. This isn't how they conceptualized this. And I think it's a really big win that everyone volunteered to switch over as soon as it was possibly available. So I think that is a real testament to making sure that you are being very transparent and thoughtful about your values and how that's going to work. And we've had the services continue to double in size every 6 months for years. We're at more than 180,000 accounts, well over 100,000 unique users. So we're pretty happy with being able to keep up with that. So the version 2 goals were to centralize registration, which was great. It was great to have only one login page option, which we did a lot of usability testing and said, you know what, we can't predict what's better, and users just have to know. We can't make it simple. We just have to make it clear. What credential are you using? And we had to do a lot. That was something that people did not think would work well for users, but it did consistently in testing. So that's something that was a big success. Being transparent about metrics was a big success. And we also introduced a self-service help page because we got a lot of support requests that weren't really OneLink issues, and we wanted to make sure that there was a vanilla place where OneLink users could log in and make sure that there was no problem with their OneLink credential. The only thing about version 2 that was not really successful, and it's something that we're still iterating on, and by no means are we done with this service, is we gave real Duke Unique IDs to everyone using it. We are not issuing EPPNs by default to those users. So anybody who was using EPPN as their key identifier, we've had to have some conversations about how we're going to navigate that. So that's kind of something that you'll probably see addressed for version 3. So moving on, the next case study, I have one more slide about this, just to kind of show you back and forth. On the left-hand side, we have 2 screenshots that show what the NetID login page looks like. There is a very tiny link that says OneLink access that nobody ever saw. And then the OneLink first version, which has a tiny little link that says sign in using a Duke NetID, which nobody saw. We ended up moving to an accordion model where things are side by side to say you can log in with your NetID, or you can log in with OneLink, but you have to choose one of those things before we're going to distract you with any more buttons, because all of the research showed that as soon as you started showing people buttons, form elements, other things, they got distracted by that and they didn't make a conscious choice. So we backed it up. We added another step. One way that we were able to kind of sell that with leadership was by putting a cookie that remembers what your past choice was and keeping that accordion open. So we did our best to make it clear. We did our best to make it convenient, but we did not do our best to make it simple. And I think as a result, we have had better experiences. So, I think it looks like there is a question. Keith, I hope you don't mind if I just jump right into that. There is a question about OneLink folding into InCommon, and our feeling about that is just that, again, OneLink is really a credential of last resort. If you have an account with another institution that you can use, then we really encourage federated access, and that's the preferable thing. OneLink is really for when people need accounts and we don't want them to have local accounts. It's a way to get going. Again, I won't say it's a simple way to get going, but it is a way to get going if you need some sort of credential.
And yet you beat me by about a second to getting to that question, Mary.
Sorry.
Thank you for noticing that.
Sure, it just it jumped out. So the next case study was we had something that we called the Duke Guest tool. And it's now the sponsored accounts tool. I won't spend too much time going into all the details about everything that we did, but one of the things that we've realized is a value for our service is that we present architecture, and people generally seem to take their responsibilities seriously as sponsors. So instead of having really complicated architecture that accounts for these sort of codified exception cases, it really makes things a lot more convenient for everyone for us to say, this is the policy is what it is. And if you want an exception to that, then you're going to need to be prepared to put your name on that and be responsible for that exception. So that was originally used to do guest accounts, but we ended up realizing that it could be used for a lot more things. We had some problems architecturally when looking at things, but we realized that users that we interviewed didn't really seem to have the same view on things. So we decided to prioritize the things that the users were having problems with, which was just identifying which items were available to them and how they worked. So the first thing that we did in moving Guest Tool to sponsored accounts, we decided that we were going to start communicating a long-term vision for this sponsorship thing as a model that people should think about for exception cases. If you need something, that's fine. We are here to help you not get in the way of your research or study or anything else. But you are going to need to be responsible for that, and there are some rules, and it's on you to be responsible for knowing those rules and following them. And we reserve the right to revoke any account at any time for any reason. So let's have a pretty low barrier to entry process in getting people the resources that they need for collaborations and other things. So we decided that we were going to start switching to sponsored accounts. We did some front-end design work to try to make options more accessible to people. And as a result, we have seen a lot of growth in this environment. It's really been a fairly agile way to accommodate users that don't really fall into other systems of record. It has facilitated a lot of partnerships with various vendors and other things. And I think it's really helped with our architecture because it gives us a place to push back when people say, well, people who have this relationship to Duke should be exempt from the policy in this way. It gives us something new to do. So when we switched from Guest Tool to sponsored accounts, we started doing some things to try to make things easier on the front end. One of those things was we have this idea of a super sponsor, and super sponsors can request guest accounts in bulk. They have to do that via pasting in a sort of Excel sort of spreadsheet type thing. But the problem was we didn't give them an example. We just gave them instructions for how to construct this template. So we had all these great ideas about how to make it, all the different iterations we were going to do on making this web interface so usable and great. We added some inline, real-time, client-side JavaScript validation of the form inputs. But really, just giving people an Excel download was all they needed, and we never heard another complaint about it again. It's 3 years later. We introduced non-person account management, so test and service accounts, to that tool. We realized that showing people access to what users, or showing people what they don't have access to, as well as what they do have access to, was very helpful in keeping people from talking to their colleagues and saying, oh, you can do that in the sponsored accounts tool, and having them choose the wrong option because they didn't see the right option. I think that's another example of a time where keeping it simple kind of bit us because we thought, well, we just won't even show it to you if you don't have the option. And now we say you don't have the ability to do this. We also introduced an idea called extended access, which is a special kind of guest account that can survive loss of other affiliations. And that's been a partial success. But although we put a lot of effort in the front end, we are still seeing problems with people not being able to self-triage into the options that they want. So I want to show you what that interface looks like now, and with a couple notes about what what we think we'll be iterating on next. So this is the current interface. There's 3 different things that you can sponsor. This is DHE Active Directory access for the medical center, affiliate accounts, or tester service accounts. one of the things that we did in the redesign was try to distinguish between the first two categories by talking about how to sponsor a non-Duke user. And we're starting to wonder now, with how poorly people self-triage, whether it's as obvious to other people what constitutes a non-Duke user as it is to us. So that's something that we'll definitely be doing some testing on. I think we've got a lot of repetitive language. People skim, and when they skim and see the same language, then they stop reading altogether, and I think that's something that we've fallen into. But these are all things that are testable. So I hope sometime to have the opportunity to talk to some of you about the next generation of what's happening with sponsored accounts. But we'll be producing some alternate layouts and testing them. And then the other thing that I wanted to mention on this one is I think that we clearly need to have a controlled vocabulary to make sure that we are talking about sponsored accounts in a consistent and predictable way. So those were my 3 case studies. I have a whole new section, but I'm not sure if there's any questions on these before. I know we're at, okay.
There was a little bit of discussion. Rob has been chiming in with Michael Getz. This is, I think, somewhat relevant regarding not limiting the OneLink service to not include logging into in-common services, and whether that is for technical reasons, and if it's kind of being overshadowed by the whole user experience. I just wondered if you had any more comments.
That's a good question, and that is a perfect reminder that actually I forgot. There's one more case study. And that is on something that we're calling Authentication Manager, which I think, let me talk about that, and it may answer the questions about our choices about how we manage in-common registration versus, the Duke IDP. So we have more than 3,000 SPs registered against our IDP. It's a massive number. It's growing very, very fast. And it's self-service at Duke. So one of the problems that we have is that we really feel like with that kind of bulk, it is critical to our mission that we have people really engaged in what their registration looks like, how it acts, what attributes they're getting, why we settled on those attributes. Because if they're working with a vendor or they need to change something about their registration or they need to request something new, we want to make sure that we're not starting from zero on that, because we can't. We have 10 people. We can't be experts on 3,000 different SPs. So one of the things is we earmarked some time to offer this analyst support program, and the analyst support program results were people feeling that we were picking on them, kind of forcing them to be engaged at a level that didn't seem necessary to them. And before I get too far into the Authentication Manager stuff, I do want to make sure that we're addressing Michael's question. I think some of the reason that we are not registering all SPs within Common is because there are quite a lot of them. And we do want to make sure that we have a self-service way for people to request things from us. We do have certainly SPs in Common, but it's not our current architectural model to put everything into in-common. We might want to have another follow-up conversation about that. So anyway, when we realized that we had this big problem where we thought, well, giving people a little bit more analyst support will help them feel comfortable with doing their own registrations, will help onboard them, they'll have better understanding of how the process works, and they'll be more equipped to navigate it later. We realized that that was largely not the case. So I have a very informational diagram here of a service owner participating in a conversation about shibboleths. This is how most of our conversations in this program go. It's Homer backing into the grass, where it's the vendor talking to us, and the service owner is like, I don't understand why I have to be here. And that's really not what we were looking to do. So what we want to do is have an application that manages this process in a way that addresses the major concerns, gets us out of the business of doing project management, et cetera. So we're trying to move to a step-based approach. I'm going to start talking quickly because I still have a lot more slides. And this is a very, very rough cut of what we're looking at piloting in January of, I didn't put a little tick there, so it's January of 2018. I was not being extremely specific about the dates. This is January 18. So our goals are to replace our existing SP registration tool with a choice between a one-page simple tool for people where it's not their first rodeo and they don't really need a lot of hand-holding, but also offer a guided walkthrough option that will let you see what the discrete components are that need to happen in the registration, kind of help clarify on each page what you're going to need to do, who's going to be responsible for that. Because one thing that we saw was that a lot of our analyst support program has ended up boiling down to reiterating these steps and what's missing, which is really more project management than identity management. So we kind of want to get out of that business. There's a lot of things that you can provide automated support on. You can see if someone pasted in an invalid certificate. You don't need an analyst to check that for you. A web app can check that for you. But the most important thing with what we're doing here is we're really on a mission to harvest metrics about where people start to find this process to be too intimidating. We don't want to lose people, but we do. And by breaking this down into discrete steps, we have the ability to find out where we're losing people and better focus our research and our efforts on making people feel comfortable sort of taking the reins of their own projects. So now I really am done with case studies, and I wanted to talk a little bit about smells. So my background, I mentioned, is in web application development, and as a web application developer, you talk a lot about smells in code, and I think that there are smells in all sorts of things, processes, policy. You know, the classic one in code is if you've got a bunch of nested loops, that's not really ideal. So while we're talking about values and models, I want to just take a couple slides to talk about ways to know that maybe your values and your models are off, or the reality is not lining up with the intention. So, and the first kind of smell that I just want to point out is the design process smell. I think if you've got people in leadership telling you how your UIs need to work, you have got a design process smell. What you should be looking for is really trying to have leadership and stakeholders telling you what faults they find with your process. We should all be making data-driven decisions, and our data-driven decisions should be open to scrutiny. And leadership should scrutinize them and ask us to defend. Did we collect this? Did we look at that? If somebody is telling you, don't do it this way, don't call this button this, call it that, you probably need to work on your design process a little bit. Declarative statements, I think probably most people on this call have seen me wince a little bit when somebody says users won't understand that, or users won't like that, or users won't get that, they won't want that. This is something that nobody knows. I don't claim to actually be a usability expert, but I have been very lucky to work closely with a lot of them, and none of them would ever say users won't want that. Instead, trying to shift your language to being like, I wonder if users would really want that. I wonder if that's really necessary. I wonder if we can test. How do we test whether users understand what we're doing here? Things like that. And then, of course, the last smell, increasing visibility of key elements through repetition. The marquee tag in HTML was retired for a reason, and that reason is that being obnoxious is not a good way to get someone's attention. So instead of feeling like you have to put the same link on a page 2 or 3 times, maybe you should be having a conversation about what's distracting from the one link that might not need to be on that. The next kind of smell is a UI development or implementation smell. And the first thing, going back to the controlled vocabulary, is sloppy language. If you are using multiple terms for one thing, one term for multiple things, or your grammar is off. I think we do want to make sure that people are, if you are using the word account, you should be thinking about, do you want the user to be thinking about their identity? Do you want them to be thinking about credentials? Do you have a more complex concept that you just really need to give a brand to? OneLink didn't originally have a name. OneLink was originally just called Social SAML, but that really didn't land well with people. And so we realized at some point we do have to give a name to this so that people understand what thing we're talking about. Careless HTML, I think my quick pointers on that is to make sure that your link text is about locations and your buttons text is about verbs. And to also note that login is not a verb, and in keeping with the season, I also wanted to note that every time you do this, an angel loses its wings. Buttons, if you want to do log space in, that's great. If you're more of a sign-in kind of campus or institution, also great. The important thing is to just try to be consistent between those things. The next smell is data-driven decision-making. Brittle backend metrics are a problem. Opinionated metrics are a problem. I think my quick TLDR on that is try to capture raw numbers instead of percentages. Raw numbers are always easier to go back and look at later. Try not to capture Booleans. It's just as cheap to get a timestamp, and you might care about the timestamp. At some point, you might want to do a correlation between what's the average time between these two events. And it's nicer than just saying, do I have a checkbox that says this event happened? And then why not freebies? It's cheap. Database space is cheap, and logs are cheap, and Splunk, maybe not cheap, but very useful. And so I think that is a great way to start collecting that stuff. And then later, when you debug all your design process smells, and someone says, well, have you considered this? You want to be in a position to be able to say, oh, well, actually, we do have some numbers that we can analyze, and we'll get back to you, as opposed to we have no way to know that, which is never an easy answer to give. You want to make sure that you're never making assumptions about intent behind action. Back-end metrics are really great for knowing what users actually do, but they're not great for knowing why the user did that or what they thought about it, what they expected was happening. So I think that they can inform good questions to take back to usability teams, but they shouldn't be taken as, all users did this, which means that that's what they wanted to do or preferred to do. It might just be because that's the option that they saw, and that's the kind of thing that only in-person usability testing can really capture. And then the last thing, I wanted to note that I think it's really good to keep your metrics published. Share them with your stakeholders, even if they are not favorable. A lot of times, showing metrics about something that's really wrong or broken in a service is a good way to focus everyone's attention on the thing that's really important to fix, instead of the perceptions of other things that may seem more important but not have the same impact. So the last slide I have are just some closing thoughts that didn't really fit anywhere else. Very literal slide. Iteration is key. I think we should always be coming back to iteration. Even if you could get it right out of the gate, your users probably wouldn't be ready for your vision. I think of this all the time working with Rob on the car project. There's a lot of things that we're building for that at Duke we don't plan on deploying in phase 1 because this is a conversation with a community. It's infrastructure for people, and people don't necessarily need all of the options all at once. Sometimes just giving them the minimum viable product and then adding over time is good. And a lot of times what people want is the one thing you didn't think of, and the 3 things you did think of, they don't even care about. Another thing, just a random rant, IAM is not kickball. You all know this. I probably should have put this in the design process smell. Anytime somebody says, well, for these users do A, and for those users do B, we have a lot of intersectionality over constituencies, and policies really need to be additive and account for the fact that you can be a member of multiple groups. Onboarding, I really think that everything comes down to onboarding, how you prime users to think about your service, what models you give them to think about your service, what values you communicate to them. That's going to make a really big difference. Keith, do you have something?
Actually, I was going to backtrack when you finished the slide.
Oh, okay. Well, I will speed read because I know we don't have too much more time. I would challenge everyone on this call to join me in participating in an experiment that I find hilarious, which is every time you hear the term A/B testing, ask the person using that term for a definition, and you will never get the same one twice. But we can all agree that A/B testing is great. I think you can A/B test. I like to A/B test sound bites about identity and access management. See if they land with people. Try doing it one way, try doing it another way, see which way gets you better experiences. And then the last thing that I wanted to say on this slide was you don't need all of these resources. I know we're all working with different teams, and we've had the luxury of the Creative and UX team to do a lot of amazing work for us. But you may not have that at your institution. So my quick bullet points for trying to iterate on your services is if you don't have a designer, your institution probably does have a style guide. Try to follow it. Make sure everything lines up on a grid. That's really all anybody cares about. That's some design advice from like 1990 for you. If you don't have a UX team, you can do your own usability testing. It's not ideal, but it's a lot better than nothing. You can do your own user testing, keep trying new things. Try talking to 6 people, change something, talk to 6 more people. If you don't have a Kirk, bring some cookies to your service desk and ask them what feedback they have for you about your services. And if all of your services are vendor products and you don't even have developers to work with, don't underestimate what people will tolerate if they feel considered and informed. You've got to do the best you can with the resources that you have, and if you find new ways to consider people, consider your users, and inform them, you're going to have a better experience and they're going to have a better experience. And so that was all I had. Keith,
and I didn't want to throw you off while we were following our noses through the smells, but a few questions came in about the Authentication Manager while we were doing that. The first one is, do the service owners or the vendors go through that sign-up process?
Great question. So we have a requirement that the registration has to happen by a Duke person. And we are starting, this is very new, this is version 1, and maybe someday you'll be so gracious as to have me back to talk about version 4 of Authentication Manager. But right now we're talking about having an integration sponsor, and that sponsor has to be a Duke person. We've talked about integrations being owned by groups, which is something that is likely to happen. And we've also talked about the ability for vendor accounts to log in and participate and help register some of those things. But for right now, for just sort of the initial launch, what we'll be looking at is how do you make sure that people are able to ask the vendor for something that the vendor can supply, able to ask us for something we can supply, and can kind of be that broker in the middle.
And the other question, and this is probably a good one to end on, are any of the examples that you used during your presentation available in source today for folks to take a look at? We also have a couple of votes for Authentication Manager to be rolled into the tier bucket of products.
Oh. Well, we'd be happy to talk more about any of this. I think we have shared our sponsored accounts code. We haven't totally open sourced any of these things, but we have definitely shared some OneLink and some sponsored account stuff in the past. People have asked us for our current SP-Reg tool, and we have given it out in the past. I would say we would be totally open. Give us through the spring to get the bugs worked out of the Authentication Manager piece, and we would be happy to share it.
And does that tool deal with a lot of the specific nitty-gritty out there of vendors who say don't accept encrypted assertions or require some wacky thing for the name ID format? Does it get into those kinds of specifics where?
Yeah, actually. So one of the things that we're working on currently is being able to automate. In the past, if anything special had to happen with name ID, we had to handle it on the back end. But sometime this month, we'll be going live in our current SP registration tool with the ability to make customizations to name ID. I'm sorry, Keith, what was the other?
Unencrypted assertions, yes.
Yeah, I think that is definitely on the roadmap. I don't think that we are going to support that right out of the gate to be able to change the defaults there, but I think that's definitely something. Again, we really want to capture metrics on what are the things that need to happen and how can we make sure that we keep the owner of the tool invested in that process and aware of why we made a certain decision or did a certain thing.
All right, very good. Well, we are approaching the top of the hour, so thank you, Mary. This was a very interesting presentation with a lot of really good content.
Well, thank you all so much. Really appreciate it.
And on your screen, you'll see the evaluation for today's IAMOnline. Please take a couple minutes to fill out this evaluation. It helps us to improve future IAMOnlines. And we also welcome your suggestions for future topics in IAMOnlines. You can include that in the evaluation form, or you can email Dean Woodbeck. His address is also on the screen. InCommon has a couple of, actually a number of interesting webinars coming up in January that we hope you'll stay tuned for. These include the certificate service work plan, the baseline expectations for InCommon that we've all been hearing a lot about, and CI Logon 2.0. So more to come on that in the coming weeks. Stay tuned for that. But that's all we have for you for today. So thank you for joining. We hope everyone has a great afternoon and a great rest of your December.
All right. Thank you all.